Wanted to make sure you're all awake earlier. That was what that was all about. Sorry about that. Okay. Actually, I'm going to put this over here. Okay. I thank you all for coming again. Some of you were here back in January, and you came back, so I'm glad to see that. This is just a continuation of what we did before. It's technically a three-part series on apologetics, but the second part is 3 parts. So, I guess it's sort of like the Trinity is 3 parts. So I wanted to make sure I had a couple sets of 3s in here. So we still have the same outcome that we had the first time, that we are Christians, and the goal here is to equip us so that we can engage those people that we encounter in the world. Okay? We want to be able to engage them intelligently, to be able to have conversations, ultimately so that we can proclaim the gospel of Christ. That's our goal. That's what God asked us to do when he gave us the Great Commission, was to go out and spread the word. And so this is, I think this is basically how we do it. It's really a matter of helping us to break down some barriers on how to do this. Now, I'm going to review very quickly what we did the last time, just so people know what we did, but I think most people were here last time. And then we'll go on to what we're going to do. But let's begin with a prayer. Dear Lord, I thank you for this opportunity to get together as Christians to learn how we might begin to start a conversation with non-Christians, how we might be able to challenge wrong beliefs, and how we might be able to challenge wrong beliefs within ourselves and to find the truth. Lord, open our hearts and our minds to you tonight and help us to seek the truth that you wish us to hear. We pray this in your Son's name, amen. All right, so in part 1, we talked a little bit about apologetics and what apologetics was, and then we went through rather quickly, because it's, again, if you all remember, I had pointed out that people get doctorates in numerous fields. In particular, you can get a doctorate in pretty much any one of these. And so we can't even begin to truly scratch the surface of answering these questions to a satisfactory level for everybody. But certainly for those that we encounter in our day-to-day lives, we should be able to get enough information about these questions to be able to answer someone saying, well, I believe all religions lead to God, and we can challenge them on that. So we looked at those, and we talked about how we know God exists, and looked at a couple arguments on how we know that God exists that we might be able to use. And I'm sorry, let me go back one. At the very bottom is I don't know why YouTube makes these really bizarre names, but that YouTube link is a video of part 1. It's the slides and the video from part 1. And on the page for that video should be a link to the handouts from part 1 as well. So if you want to go back and watch that again, you certainly can. This one will also be posted to YouTube as well. My hope is that all of them will be posted to YouTube so that people can watch them. So I'll give you all a second to write down that. I meant to put it in the handout, and I forgot to do that. Can you see that? It's little p, 7, little z, capital J, little z, capital P, or capital C, capital P, little v, little m. And YouTube has a period before the B. Okay. So if you want to go back and review those, please do so. So we talked about how we know God exists, looked at 4 primary arguments that are used a lot as to how we know God exists. We talked about how we know that the Bible is reliable, how we can challenge other people's beliefs that the Bible is not reliable by looking at different aspects of this, how we actually do textual criticism using manuscript evidence, where were the writers, how soon after the writing did all this happen, who were they, did other people support it, and all that stuff. And we looked at all those areas around the reliability of the Bible. We talked about Jesus' claim to be God. A number of people say Jesus is a great man, but he's not God. That's not what the Bible says. Jesus made it very clear that he was God, so you either think he is or you think he's a nut. But he can't be anything else than one of those two things. And then lastly, we talked about a few religions and how, in fact, they can't all lead to the same God. And in fact, some of them don't lead to a God at all. But there are obviously plenty more religions out there than just these 6. But we looked at these because these are pretty much the primary religions that we might encounter in our area. So in this part, we're going to look at, we're primarily going to be looking at logic. And I realize that it's going to be a little technical. We're going to get into some Latin words will come up and things like that. Now, I want to remind everybody, this is an introduction to apologetics, a gentle introduction to apologetics. So again, people get PhDs in logic. They spend their entire lives studying logical arguments and the different fallacies that exist, and they'll gladly contest you on any of these things if you want to talk to a philosopher. That is not the intent of this series. This series is to help us as Christians, as lay people in the community, to be able to recognize when someone makes a claim, you can, in your mind, say, well, there's something wrong with that. Now, you might not be able to say, that is an ad hominem. But you would be able to say, they're attacking me. And that is completely groundless. And therefore, you can then deal with that issue. So you don't have to be a philosopher to be able to recognize that someone's attacking you, and that has absolutely nothing to do with your argument. And that's what I want us to get out of this. I want us to be able to recognize these kind of things, not necessarily name them. There will be no test. Then we will get into, so we're going to talk about conditions of intelligibility, which I'll explain in a minute. We'll talk about logic. And then at the very end will be how we actually apply this in practice. Now, this is the 3-part series that this will be covered in. We're focusing on part 1 and 2 up here. In the next session, we'll finish part 2, and the third one we'll do the third part. Now, I do want to point out there are a lot of great resources out there, and in particular, they should be in your handout, 3 books, 2 of which I have actual hard copies of. The third one, I have it as an ebook, and it's a great book, and I highly recommend it, and I'm planning on getting it as a hard copy. But one of them, which is the primary source that I used for this series, is called The Ultimate Proof of Creation by Jason Lisle. This is put out by Answers in Genesis. It's a great book. It focuses very heavily on a creationist argument and how we actually have the ultimate proof that God created the universe and all that. But he goes into a lot of depth on logical arguments and that kind of thing, which is why I use this a lot. Another one, Alistair McGrath, Mere Apologetics. And the last one is Greg Kokel's Tactics, which is the one I have as an ebook, so imagine that it's there. And it's a great book. The thing I really like about Tactics, I use Tactics and the ultimate proof a lot in what I'm going to be talking about this second part. The great thing about Tactics is it really is about just you and me going out there and having conversations with people. Greg Kokel uses a lot of examples that he had when he was sitting there. It seems like he does this a lot, and he points it out in his book, about conversations he has with waitresses, where he's just sitting out having dinner, and a waitress makes some claim, and I can't let that go. I'm going to challenge it. And he challenges it, but he gives us some good examples as to how he can go about challenging it. So that is what we're going to talk about today. Come on in. Howdy. There are some handouts in the last row of the chair. No, in the last row of the chairs here. There's some handouts. So I want to begin by just sort of a broad topic of just, like, does a particular claim pass a smell test kind of thing? First off, we don't allow people to just be arbitrary. You can't just say whatever you want. There's got to be some grounding to what it is that you're saying. So can't be arbitrary. And you can't be inconsistent. If you're going to have a worldview, it's got to be consistent. If it's inconsistent, it is by definition false, because it's not consistent. There's something wrong in your worldview, and that can't happen. And so if we have a worldview or make a claim, it must be consistent with everything else that we're claiming, or else there's something wrong with what we have. So really it comes down to three questions that you could ask when someone makes some claim that you think is just totally outlandish. One, is it possible? If it's not possible, you can challenge them on that. What you just claimed is not even possible. It is not possible for God to create something so heavy that he can't lift it. It's not possible. And the claim might be that, well, then he can't create everything, but you're asking him to create something that's not possible to do. And so therefore it's absurd what you're asking. So it's not possible. So is the claim possible? Is the claim plausible? Right? Something could be possible, but it's just not plausible. One example I could think of is, could the Atlanta Braves win the next 50 games? Yes. Is it possible? Absolutely. I mean, we know it's possible. Any team can win the next 50 games in a baseball series. It's possible. Is it plausible? Absolutely not. It doesn't matter how good the Braves are right now. I have no idea how good they are, so I'm not picking on the Braves, but it doesn't matter how good they are. Pick the best team in the major leagues. Is it plausible for them to win the next 50? No, it is not. Now, if I told you they won the past 40, then you might say, well, it might be plausible now because they've won 40, even 49. But the probability of them doing it is even more absurd. Okay? So those three questions are things that we would want to be asking in our mind. Is this possible? Is it plausible? Is it probable? Okay? And there's each one going down a little bit further down the series. Any questions? Okay. So the conditions of intelligibility. What I mean by that is, to begin with, certain things just have to be true. Okay? For us to even be able to begin talking about having an argument with someone and being able to reason through things, we are already assuming certain things are true. One, that we actually have the capability of reasoning, that there is such a thing as a reasoned argument, those kind of things. So we have this set of things that we have to assume already exist. Now, it has to be consistent in your worldview. They can't be something that you assume exists, but then is immediately violated by your worldview. So these have to be consistent with your worldview, but we have to assume they're there to begin with. So to begin with, the laws of logic are one of the conditions of intelligibility. We assume that they're there. And we do so because the first thing people are going to try to do is argue that they're there. And if you want to argue that the law of logic exists, you already assume that it does exist. If one wants to argue that they don't, then they're being inconsistent. Now, certainly, non-Christians might like to say, that these things evolved, that the laws of logic just evolved, this, natural selection. The problem with that is the laws of logic aren't something that's part of nature. They transcend that. They're not a physical object, so they couldn't have evolved. And another issue with that would be if they evolved, as we know, some things evolve in one set of creatures, if this is all true. One thing evolved in one set of creatures, and it evolves a different way in other creatures. Therefore, if this was true, if this actually evolved, they wouldn't be laws. Laws are universal. They're true for everybody, everywhere, at all time. So they could not have possibly have happened through some kind of natural selection process. They have to be laws. They exist for everybody. And therefore, we assume that they exist. Now, as a Christian, this isn't so hard for us, is it? We have no problem with this. God is self-consistent, is he not? 2 Timothy 2:13, if we are faithless, he remains faithful. He cannot deny himself. He's consistent. Colossians 2:3, in whom are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. Talking about God. God contains all wisdom and knowledge. Hebrews 1:3, he is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature, and he upholds the universe by the word of his power. After making purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the majesty on high. So God is truth and knowledge and does not deny himself. For a Christian, the fact that the laws of logic have existed for all eternity makes total sense and is completely consistent within our worldview of Christianity. So the next one is morality, right? Ask somebody if there are things that are right and wrong. Now, a non-Christian will tell you, it's up to you. Well, my suggestion would be the next time someone says that is to smack them. Because what are they going to say when you do that? What did you do that for? Well, it was right for me. Right? No way. No way. That would never fly. They would immediately take offense to the fact that they were slapped, thus justifying within themselves that they are violating their own sense of morality. They say it's right, whatever you want is right for you, but as soon as you go against that and you actually apply that rule to them, they don't like it. Because in honesty, that's not how morality works. Morality works like this. It's wrong. It's wrong for everybody. Is it wrong? Well, here's another one. Ask them if it's wrong to abort a baby, and they'll say, absolutely, it's wrong to kill a baby. It's going to be born into a home that's not a good home for it. And then say, well, that 2-year-old lives in that same home. Should we kill the 2-year-old? And what are they going to say to that? Heck no, you don't kill the 2-year-old. What's wrong with you? Well, is that not inconsistent to tell me that it's wrong to kill the baby that's not born yet? Or that it's not wrong to kill the baby that's not born yet, but it is wrong to kill the one that lives there? It's inconsistent. We know within ourselves it's wrong to kill a baby. So the justification is the one that's not born isn't a baby yet. And therefore it is okay to kill something that is not a baby. That is the justification for that. The next one is our reliability of our senses, right? We trust that what we see is what we see. Right now, I trust that I'm actually talking to some people who are sitting out here, and it's not a figment of my imagination, somehow a dream that this is all going on. I trust that this is reliable. If I'm going to conduct science and actually perform some scientific experiments, I trust that what I see, what I hear, what I can touch and smell are all things that are generally reliable. And that when I smell something the first time, the next time I smell it, it's the same thing, right? We don't say that what you smell and what I smell, it's just whatever you want to smell. It is what I smell. Now, we may smell differently, but there are scientific things we can do to show why we smell differently. Smell this way, not, smell. We may smell differently, we may see differently, but that doesn't get away from the general reliability of our senses, and that we assume that those things actually are reliable. Another one, which is in the same category, would be the fact that our memory is also assumed to be reliable. I mean, how'd you get here? You remembered how to get here, didn't you? Now, are you sure you remembered how you got here? How do you know that you know how to get here? You see, we don't actually have to figure this. We just know. We know, we can assume that our memories are generally reliable. Now, granted, we sometimes forget where we stick our keys, and we have other issues where things might cause us to not remember certain things. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about general reliability, that in general, our memories are reliable. Another one, uniformity in nature. Now, this is not the claim that evolutionists mean when they talk about uniformity in nature. Although, in some senses, it is. We can say, as a Christian, I believe that things have been operating from the beginning in the same way. Right? God put into motion, in Genesis 1:1, the creation of the universe. And from that moment on, things have operated the same way. He put it all into motion, and he sustains it. Right? Now, if you're not a Christian, why do you assume that the universe is consistent in that fashion? Like, why would that be? What would cause it to be that way? There's a difficulty there that I think non-Christians have. We talked about this the last time, why there is a God. There have been some scientific studies into the existence of the universe and whether the universe actually has a beginning or not. And there definitely are some ripples out there, and I cannot remember the name of the gentleman, the three gentlemen that did the study that actually proved if the universe is expanding, it had a beginning. I mean, it seems obvious, doesn't it? I mean, if something's expanding, it clearly had to have some starting point. Now, evolutionists and uniformitarians, people who believe that the universe has existed and don't believe in a God, have all kinds of claims as to how the universe might have begun. But ultimately, what these three gentlemen have proven through physics is that if the universe is expanding, which they have proven it is, then the universe had an absolute beginning. Now, of course, I mean, the Big Bang, that was the beginning, right? But it had a beginning. Now, we're okay with that, right? God, Genesis 1:1, created the universe. I agree. It had a beginning. And from that point on, it's been universally consistent in what it's been doing. Everything makes sense. And we all, even scientists, are generally agreeable to that fact. We just don't agree on time frames. And the last one is personal dignity and freedom. Again, going back to our discussion earlier, if you smack them, they're going to be immediately offended by that. Because we all know that we all deserve some level of dignity and freedom. That's why so many people fight for freedom in this world. Because we know that is a fundamental right that people should have, is freedom. Now, again, as Christians, this is totally consistent with our particular worldview. Any questions? I built in these spots just in case people had questions. I don't want to go on. Now, so these conditions of intelligibility, we just assume all these things have to be there. But they have to be consistent in our worldview in order for the worldview to be a coherent, consistent worldview, which we as Christians believe that ours is the only one that actually is consistent in all ways. Okay. All right. So then let's get into to logic. When we talk about logic, we'll get into to some more of this in the second part of in the second session of part 2, about arguments and how they're constructed. But I want to look at just a simple argument. In an argument, the makeup of an argument goes like this. There are propositions, and propositions are nothing but a statement that can be true or false. Okay, my eyes are blue, the sky is white, all humans have hearts. These are all statements that have a truth to them, either true or false. They can be one or the other. That is a proposition. We construct an argument by taking these propositions and putting them together. Okay, and now this is an argument in a logical sense, not an argument between two people who disagree. An argument in logic is nothing but a series of statements that assert a claim of some sort through these premises. It has a conclusion. If it's an argument, it should have some kind of conclusion. You're trying to prove something, so you're concluding something. And the conclusion to an argument generally found at the end. Usually the tip-off is the word therefore or the implied therefore. So in this case, therefore I have a heart, therefore is implied. The premises are those things that aren't the conclusion. They actually set up the argument so that we get to the point where we can make our conclusion. These are all the truth claims that I need in order to make an argument, a conclusion to be true. So those are the premises. So in logic, there's two kinds. There's inductive and deductive logic. And deductive, this is an example of a deductive argument. It is true or it is false. It's nothing else. In inductive, we can get a level of truthfulness, but we can't actually get to a full truth through an inductive argument. We are trying to make some kind of claim that we can't actually assert 100%. And that's what we do through inductive arguments. And they can be strong or weak arguments, but they'll never be 100% foolproof. A deductive argument can be either a valid argument or an invalid argument. We're obviously interested in valid arguments. Invalid arguments are the kind that we're trying to pick off. When someone else makes an invalid argument, we want to be able to say, that's an invalid argument. A valid argument is one where the conclusion follows from the premises. Okay, you made a couple premises, and then you made a conclusion from those. If that conclusion follows, it's a valid argument. Doesn't matter whether you like it. Doesn't even have to be true. It's just valid. Now, a sound argument is a valid argument where the premises are true. Okay? So remember, a valid argument is one where the conclusion follows from the premises. They don't have to be true. They just, if they were true, the conclusion would follow. And a sound argument is one where the premises are true. So this one up here, all humans have hearts. I am a human. Do all humans have hearts? That's a true statement, right? And I am a human. I think that's a true statement. Therefore, I have a heart. This is a valid argument, and it's also sound because it's true. Questions? Y'all are quiet. So one thing we need to dispense of early on is that one of the laws in logic is the law of non-contradiction. You can't have a thing and not thing happen at the same time. I can't be here and not here, right? I'm either here or I'm not. I'm not both. And that is the law of non-contradiction. So a couple of examples. Nobody goes there anymore. It's too crowded. I mean, this is a silly example. I mean, you've heard this claim before. You know, people just say this, and hey, I don't go there anymore. It's too, it's too crowded. Well, that's absurd. That can't be. If nobody goes there anymore, it can't be too crowded because nobody goes there anymore. So that's clearly not possible. Now I know they're not being serious. They're making an absurd claim that they don't actually mean to be. Another claim, which people do actually mean to be serious, is there is no truth. Now the problem here is that true? Because if it's true, the claim is false, right? If there is no truth, and I say there is no truth, I just contradicted myself. So either there is or there isn't. You can't make this claim. Okay? You shouldn't force your views on other people. Now this has all kinds of problems with it, but certainly it does have this sort of non-contradiction because isn't that exactly what they're doing? If someone makes this claim, now it's not necessarily wrong. It's just it's a contradiction to say this and to actually make this claim. You can't force your views. If you say that to someone, you are forcing your views on them, and therefore are contradicting your own claim. And Greg Koukl calls this infanticide in his book, that it kills itself. Before it even begins, it's already killing itself. These things, they don't make any sense. A good God would not let evil things happen. A loving God would never send anyone to hell. Right? And that's, many people in our world like that. They like to say, well, I mean, I don't know how you could ever believe in God. All this evil in the world. Yep. I know there's a lot of evil in the world. And as soon as you say that evil person is, that Hitler, had he accepted Christ, could have gone to heaven, would cause their fur to rise, like that would not be possible. How could Hitler ever have had that opportunity? Well, because if he would have accepted Christ, he could have. Now, I don't think it was possible by the time that his life was over, but certainly the possibility was there at some point in his life that could have happened. But this is a contradiction. You can't have a God that opposes evil but then turns around and embraces it at the same time. That's a contradiction. Another interesting thing about that, about this last claim, how could God allow evil? If you don't believe in God to begin with, what is evil? Right? I mean, isn't that a good question to ask him? So how do you define evil? Because I have a real easy one. I believe in God, and God defined evil for me. He said, this is evil, this is not. That's pretty straightforward. But if you don't believe in God, then you don't even have an argument to stand on here anyways, because you don't even have a way to define evil. So they definitely have more than one issue here, but that's not necessarily a contradiction. It just presents some other problems. So let's look at some logical fallacies. There are 6 of them. Again, now I want to remind you, we're going to go through them. One of these has got 6 parts or 7 parts to it. Our goal here is to be able to recognize these things, to be able to see it happen and not necessarily be able to say that's special pleading, but to be able to recognize special pleading for what it is and how you might go about responding to it. Now, we're going to talk about how we go about responding to that in the second and third sessions, but right now we're just looking at how we would recognize these things when we see them. So ambiguity. Obviously, we're just being ambiguous in what we claim. And there's 2 primary ways of doing this. One is called an equivocation. That is, we use a word in 2 ways. One, we try to make a claim that everyone will agree with, and then we'll try to follow it up with another one that supports our stance, and we'll equivocate. So here's an absurd example. Practice makes perfect. Doctors practice medicine, so doctors must be perfect. They're equivocating on the word practice, because practice clearly means different things in this argument. So this is an argument that commits the ambiguity fallacy. One that, if you read Jason Lau's book, obviously if you read Jason Lau's book, you'd immediately think of one, and that would be, if you're taking a creationist stance, you're clearly opposed to evolution, and evolution is quite often equivocated on. That a scientist will talk about evolution in nature. If you think back, if you've ever heard of the example of the peppered moths, I can't even remember where it was now, but anyhow, scientists found some peppered moths on a tree that were, light on dark. A couple years later, they go out there and see all these moths have turned to dark on light, and clearly something happened. They evolved, is the claim. So clearly, evolution is true. That is, we evolved out of, from the same animal as monkeys. Whoa. First off, the evolution that they're describing in this very small instance, sometimes called microevolution, correctly called natural selection, is a scientifically established, well understood process that every scientist on the planet totally agrees with. What happens is things are naturally selected in their environment based on environmental pressures that are going on. This happens all the time. Every scientist would agree with it. That's why it's used. Because then they use the argument to try to show evolution across species is actually happening in the same fashion. But we're talking about a different kind of evolution. And so, therefore, we're equivocating on this word evolution. You try to make a claim that everyone will say, I buy it, I totally agree. And then they'll follow it up with another one that, wait a minute, something's not right there. This doesn't pass the smell test. It is ambiguous, and intentionally so. The other one is reification. Also, again, an example out of creationist thinking is that nature will select things to happen. Nature cannot select things. Nature is not a being. Now, I'll grant most of the time people probably aren't using it in the sense that they're trying to convey that this is a being, but certainly in the case of evolution, they want to convey it that way. They want to convey that nature is doing the selecting, that it's not a God doing it, it's nature. Although that then puts nature into a position of God, therefore they have a God. But that's something they don't recognize. So reification is actually trying to make something into a being that is not a being to begin with. Okay. Presumption. Committing this fallacy, you assume something but never actually say it. And it's not right to, in an argument, to have an assumption that you haven't actually made clear. If it's part of your argument, it needs to be made clear. So there are a number of these. One of them would be a hasty generalization. This can happen quite easily. It was hot today. It's always hot here. It's just always hot here. Well, I have one sample, and I cannot make a generalization from that one sample. That's a hasty generalization. Another one would be a sweeping generalization. That is, you have a series of points that you can use to make a generalization, but then you extend it out even further. Nothing is true just because someone says it is. Okay, that is a valid statement. Therefore, you shouldn't just accept everything God says. Whoa. How did we get from the first statement to the second one? That is a sweeping generalization, one that we can agree on the first statement, the first premise. We cannot agree on this conclusion. It's way too sweeping. There are some unstated assumptions going on in this argument that we need to see before we could agree to it, if we were going to agree to it. But we need to see what they are before we can. The next one is called a bifurcation. That is, we set up an argument as if there's only two choices, and then knock one of them down. And now you're left with the other. But the problem with a bifurcation is, in these kind of fallacies, is that there's not only two choices. If I tell you that the traffic light is either red or green, you know that's not true. There is a third choice. It could be yellow. Now, we have this, we describe it as red and green are contrary. It can't be both red and green unless the light's broken. A properly functioning traffic light can be red or green or some other color, but it can't be red and green. So we call that contrary, right? It can't be both, but it might be able to be another one. If there was only two choices, they would be contradictory. But in this case, there are at least one more choice to be had. The other ones, the last one there's up there to show an example of that they can actually both be true. The middle one, you either live by faith or you are a rational thinker, right? Can't you be both? I live by faith, and I definitely am a rational thinker, and so I think that these are possible to do both. The next one's begging the question, that we actually assume what we're arguing. Miracles are impossible because they cannot happen. Right? You just assume that they are not possible before you said that. Science is defined, the proper scientific study to a naturalistic scientist is one that shows how things in the world have happened through natural processes. Okay, which automatically begs the question, because what if the world was created through some other fashion? Scientists have assumed that it's all happening through natural processes, but as Christians we know there was at least one moment in time where something non-natural occurred. And that was when the universe was actually created. That was not natural. And so that would be begging the question. The next one, I always have trouble with this word. Question, begging, epithet. And I'm sure are all familiar with this. This is basically setting up the statement such that you don't even want to be a part of this. The criminal is charged with the vicious murder of the innocent victim. How many people have heard this on the news? You hear these kind of things, you read them in the paper. the loaded language that's being used, and I wish I could only blame non-Christians for this, but certainly Christians do the same thing. We load the statements that we're making, these claims, with these phrases that are question-begging. We are assuming certain things about the person before we actually have even looked into this. First off, is this a criminal? Or is it someone being charged with a crime? Right? In our country, you're innocent until proven guilty, and therefore the person who is being charged is assumed to be innocent. It is some person who is being charged with a crime. I don't know. I also don't know whether the victim was innocent. For all I know, the victim was actually attacking the person who killed them, and that is why the person's dead to begin with. So, and it might not have been vicious, it might have been, I don't know. But this is very loaded language. It is committing a fallacy. If we can get away from the fallacy and actually try to get at what we're saying here, we can have a more rational discussion about it. And the last one here is a complex question. I'm sorry, the next last one is a complex question. Why are creationists against science? Do you see the assumption there? This really should be two questions. One, are creationists against science? And then two, if they are, why are they against it? Would be a proper way of stating it. This type of question is a complex question. There's actually multiple questions involved. I'm sure you all have heard, have you stopped beating your wife? No one wants to answer the question. Because if you answer the question, you're assuming that what they claimed is already true. I was beating my wife, and no, I'm no longer doing that. Or, yes, I have stopped. Or no, I have not stopped. So you're still beating her? No, I never started to begin with. You can't answer the question. It's a complex question. These questions are designed so that you are not able to answer them without getting yourself into a bind. That's what we want to happen when we ask a complex question. And the last one is the no true Scotsman. I like this. This is my favorite one. I can't do a Scottish accent. But every time I read this one, I think it's in Scottish in my head. I can hear it. So just imagine Scottish. No Scotsman puts sugar on his porridge. Oh, Angus is a Scotsman who puts sugar on his porridge. Well, no true Scotsman puts sugar on his porridge. What is a true Scotsman? One that puts sugar on his porridge or doesn't put sugar on his porridge? This is a no true Scotsman fallacy. You're assuming that there is something about being a true Scotsman that needs to be defined before we can actually start talking about this. So we're assuming that we know what a true Scotsman is like. And that would be one that doesn't put sugar on his porridge, apparently. So next one, special pleading. Person is applying a double standard. Going back to our argument earlier, you can't force your morals on someone else. That's a double standard. And you cannot just assume the Bible is true. You must have some proof in order to justify it. Really? So how can you assume that it's not true? Do you have proof to justify that? Or don't you need any proof for that? That's a fallacy of special pleading. We can't just have a standard that we apply to everybody else and not to ourselves. Am I going too fast? Okay. The next one's false analogy. If we want to compare two things, but they don't, we're going to compare them in a way that they don't actually have that trait in common, but they do have some things in common. In this example here, why should you complain about working a 12-hour day? Computers work 24 hours a day, man. They never stop working. Well, who cares? Right? Just because computers work 24 hours a day doesn't mean that I need to. And in some ways, I'd actually think of this argument as a bifurcation. Not a bifurcation, I'm sorry. Ambiguity, where we're actually defining work in more than one way, because computers don't actually work the same way people do. And so we're playing on this word work in this particular claim, but it is a false analogy, that we're actually trying to find two things that have some relationship, but to be able to make a claim that's irrelevant. In false cause, we have a situation where we're trying to conclude a cause and effect when there actually isn't one there. Walking under a ladder brings bad luck is definitely a fallacy of false cause. Right? Can you walk under a ladder and not have bad luck? As long as they don't drop the paint can on you. Need to find some examples out of the newspaper, because these are definitely examples that come quite often in the news. And the last one is the slippery slope. And this one we can use to our advantage quite a lot. If someone is making a claim and then try to show that a particular course of events will lead to some absurd result, they are committing the slippery slope fallacy if, in fact, there are other ways to deal with or to circumvent that particular outcome. My example here, if we allow for the possibility of miracles, then science would come to a halt. We'd never know if we were observing the laws of nature or a miracle. That is a slippery slope argument. By definition, miracles are rare to begin with. There weren't many committed through recorded history as far as we know. And therefore, it is fairly easy to know whether you are observing something in nature or a miracle, since the likelihood of it being a miracle is incredibly low. Very, very, very low. And so that would be a slippery slope argument that we would not accept. Any questions? I know that was a lot. And that's all we're going to do today. 3 weeks from now, because July 11th, it's the 11th or the 17th, whatever. I think it might be the 17th. 3 weeks from now, we'll have our second session. I will quickly go over these same fallacies again to begin with. And then I'll continue on. I'll just show you what I'm going to do next time. I'm going to talk about fallacies of relevance. And those are the fallacies of relevance that we'll talk about. And then I'm going to talk about formal deductive logic. And we'll look at some arguments and the flaws in the arguments, and how arguments are structured and how they can be structured incorrectly. That's what we'll look at next time. And then in the third session of this part, we'll actually look at applying these in real situations where someone will make a claim, and we'll actually look at what fallacy is being committed here, and how might we actually respond to that fallacy. Because that's really what we're trying to get to. And actually, the third part, which will happen sometime in the fall, is a continuation of that, looking at some specific topics as well as some more real-world examples of how we'd actually apply all these things in a real setting. Any questions? That is all I have for you tonight. Thank you. You should, I don't know if I put the resources on this one, but these are available in the first part. The handout had the resources in it. And the only other thing which should be in your handout were the books that I recommended should be in your handout. And so I would highly recommend those. Well, I look forward to seeing you all here in a couple weeks where we pick this up and look at the last bit of logic. And then we'll get down to the brass tacks, right? Thank you all. Yeah, I kept it to an hour. Look at that.